quiet motorway in England. Two sisters appear, walking calmly along the central reservation, as if the world around them doesn't exist. Drivers swerve, police arrive, and then chaos erupts. One of the most bizarre and shocking cases in modern British history is about to unfold. This is the story of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson, a tale of shared madness, mayhem, and the fine line between sanity and terror. I'm Fiona, and this is Case Continued. Sabina and Ursula Eriksson were identical twin sisters from the quiet Swedish town of Sunne. Born on the 3rd of November 1967, they were the youngest of four children and grew up in what seemed like a happy, ordinary family. There was no signs of mental illness, no history of substance abuse, just a loving, hard-working family, and two twin sisters leading normal lives. Until 2008. By then, their paths had diverged. Ursula had moved to the United States, and Sabina was living in Mallow, County Cork in Ireland, with her husband and two children. But on Friday, May the 16th, everything changed. Ursula arrived to visit her sister unannounced. She just hopped on over from the US to Ireland and surprised her sister with a visit. What started as a simple get-together and catch-up would soon turn into a journey that absolutely defied reason. Overnight, the sisters travelled by ferry to Liverpool, arriving early Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. Now, nobody knows why they chose to go to Liverpool. They had no family connection there. They had no friends there that anybody knew of. Plenty of people, of course, do just visit Liverpool. It is a lovely city. But it just seemed like such a strange choice to everybody who knew them. By 11:30 a.m, the sisters had boarded a National Express coach bound for London. On the surface, it seemed routine, a simple trip. Maybe they were going shopping, see the sights. But beneath that calm exterior, something dark and unpredictable was brewing. The sisters didn't reach their destination. Instead, they got off the bus at Kiel Services on the M6 motorway, the longest motorway in the UK, 6 lanes wide with a central median. CCTV cameras captured the sisters walking along the central reservation before attempting to cross the lanes. Drivers began putting calls into the police, thinking that this behaviour was not just dangerous, but quite unusual. Highways agency officers responded, and police from the Central Motorway Police Group were called to assist. Coincidentally, a small television crew was filming motorway cops with the officers nearby, and so the film crew attended the scene with the officers. At first, the twins appeared calm. They were talking to officers, chatting on the roadside, seemingly harmless. But while the police were being briefed about the incident, everything suddenly erupted. Without warning, Ursula bolted into the road, colliding with a Mercedes-Benz Actros 2546 articulated lorry, travelling around 56 miles an hour or 90 kilometres per hour. Sabina quickly followed her into the road and was struck head-on by a Volkswagen Polo travelling at high speed. Both sisters, surprisingly, survived. Ursula was actually immobilised as the lorry had crushed both of her legs, while Sabina remained unconscious on the road for around 15 minutes. Paramedics rushed to treat them, but Ursula resisted medical aid, and she started spitting, scratching and screaming. She shouted at the officers restraining her, "I recognise you. I know you're not real." Sabina, who woke in a furious and quite combative state, screamed, "They're going to steal your organs." To the surprise of the police, Sabina got to her feet despite multiple attempts from officers to keep her down. She screamed for help and called for the police, even though the police were already present, before striking an officer in the face and running into traffic yet again on the other side of the motorway. Emergency workers and bystanders intervened, with 6 people needed to restrain Sabina and carry her to a waiting ambulance, where she was handcuffed and had to be medically sedated. Given the similarity in their behaviour, authorities quickly suspected some kind of pact to take their own lives or drug involvement. Ursula was airlifted to the hospital, where she spent months recovering from her injuries. Sabina was taken to a local hospital, and despite the chaos and apparent lack of concern for her twin sister's condition, she became calm and was released just 5 hours later. In police custody, she remained really relaxed, joking with the officers, being a little bit flirtatious, worried about how her hair was and if she looked okay. And at one point, she even remarked, "We say in Sweden, an accident rarely comes alone. Usually, at least one more follows, maybe 2. Toxicology report came back clean. There was no drugs in the system, no alcohol. On May the 19th, 2008, Sabina pleaded guilty to trespassing on the motorway and assaulting a police officer, and she was sentenced to just 1 day in jail, time that she'd already effectively served while she was being held overnight. But what had truly happened on that motorway? A police report later revealed that the sisters had suddenly disembarked from the bus at Kiel Services, claiming that they didn't feel well. But the driver, however, said that he'd dropped them off after becoming really quite suspicious of their erratic behaviour. They were clinging tightly to their bags and they refused a search, which the drivers often do on the National Express coaches. And this refusal prompted the driver to actually prevent them from reboarding. He didn't know what was going on with them. He just felt that something was quite wrong and there could be a problem if they got back on that coach. The service station manager also noticed their odd behaviour as well and called the police. But when officers arrived, the sisters seemed harmless. They were just chatting away. Fine. No one could have predicted the terrifying events that were about to unfold, because this was more than a bizarre incident on a motorway. It was a glimpse into the minds of 2 people sharing a dangerous, incomprehensible reality, and worse was yet to come. After being released from custody, Sabina Eriksson aimlessly wandered around the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, carrying her possessions and her sister's possessions in a clear plastic bag that had been given to her by the police. And she was also wearing Ursula's green top, which was shredded in places and ripped from the collision with a high-speed moving vehicle on the motorway. At 7 p.m, 2 local men spotted Sabina while walking their dog on Christchurch Street in Fenton after they'd spent an evening together in the pub for a few drinks. And it was here that fate intervened. One of these men was Glenn Hollinshead, 54, and a retired RAF airman, paramedic and self-employed welder. The other man was Glenn's friend, Peter Malloy, and he was 27. The men approached Sabina, who appeared friendly and really polite, but obviously they kind of noted her anxious demeanour and the fact that she was wearing this shredded, ripped top. But she stroked the dog throughout the conversation, and she was being nice to the men, and she was asking them for directions to any nearby bed and breakfasts or hotels. And she was claiming that she was trying to locate her sister, who had been hospitalised. With no nearby accommodations available, Glenn, taking pity on her, offered to take her back to his home on Duke Street and promised to help her find Ursula. When they got inside the house, the trio opened some drinks, and Sabina's odd behaviour continued. She appeared restless. She was constantly glancing out of the windows, and at times she seemed really paranoid. At one point, she offered the men cigarettes from a packet that she'd been smoking all night. But when they placed the cigarettes in their mouths, she suddenly screamed that they might be poisoned and they couldn't smoke them because if they were poisoned, they'd all die. Peter Malloy was quite unnerved by this behaviour, so he left around midnight. And Glenn assured him that everything would be fine and Sabina was still okay to stay at his home. The following day, around noon, Glenn contacted his brother, asking him about local hospitals and how best to try and locate Ursula, and he just explained what had happened the night before when he'd met Sabina. At around 7:40 p.m. that evening, while preparing a meal for himself and Sabina, he stepped outside to ask a neighbour for some tea bags because he'd run out. The neighbour watched him walk back into his property, but just moments later he stumbled back outside, bleeding and shouting, "She stabbed me! She stabbed me!" Before collapsing, he urged his neighbour to look after his dog.
Thank you for calling 999. What's your emergency, please?
Despite emergency calls, Glenn succumbed to his injuries. As Glenn's neighbour was calling 999, Sabina fled the house and was captured on nearby CCTV, running through the streets in a state of frenzied panic. In her escape, she began striking herself over the head with a hammer that she'd taken from Glenn's home. A pedestrian passing by in a car who saw her behaviour tried to intervene and wrestled a hammer from her, but she struck him over the head with a roof tile that she had in her pocket and then continued running. Her bizarre actions ended at Heron Cross when, as paramedics caught up with her, in a desperate act, she leapt from a 12-metre or 40-foot bridge onto the A50, sustaining a skull fracture and fracturing both ankles. She was rushed to hospital and subsequently taken into police custody. Weeks later, on September the 11th, she left hospital in a wheelchair, only to be immediately charged with the murder of Glenn Hollinshead. Ursula, her twin, was also discharged from hospital around this time, but she quietly returned to Sweden before eventually relocating to the United States, leaving England and the chaos that she helped create behind. Sabina's trial was initially scheduled for February 2009, but it hit some roadblocks, and medical records from Sweden were really slow to arrive. So the court eventually set a new date, aiming for September the 1st, 2009. The following day, Sabina pled guilty to manslaughter, citing diminished responsibility. She admitted to stabbing Glenn 5 times, yet she never spoke of her motives. She just answered no comment to every single question. The shocking footage from the M6 motorway, where she'd thrown herself into traffic, was never actually presented to the court. Even experts struggled to define the twins' condition. Some diagnosed Sabina with induced delusional disorder, others argued for acute polymorphic psychotic disorder. But for Glenn Hollinshead's brother, the confusion offered no comfort. How could someone who had just hurled herself into traffic, not once, but 3 times, be considered safe? At the motorway, she'd screamed, spat, struck out, requiring 6 people to restrain her. In Glenn's brother's eyes, if she'd been kept under closer supervision, Glenn might still be alive. Officially, Sabina had been evaluated by 3 professionals: a police surgeon, a psychiatrist, and a social worker. And their conclusion? She was no danger to anyone. Yet, to any of us watching her previous actions, it seems painfully clear that a person repeatedly throwing themselves in front of moving vehicles is unstable and potentially deadly. Psychiatrists ultimately agreed that Sabina was legally insane at the time of Glenn's murder, though by the trial, her mental state had normalised. The defence argued that she'd been the secondary twin in a rare psychiatric condition known as Folie à deux, or shared psychosis, a madness of 2. Ursula, the primary twin, had been consumed by delusions, and Sabina had absorbed them. Experts suggested that she'd experienced a disorder that caused her to hear incomprehensible voices. At Nottingham Crown Court, Justice Saunders acknowledged the tragedy while explaining the reasoning behind the sentence. That Sabina's actions had been driven by mental illness, limiting her culpability. Her delusions dictated her behaviour, and the onset of her condition had been sudden and unavoidable. He said that no punishment could reflect the life lost, but the court sought to balance justice with the reality of her illness. Sabina received a 5-year prison sentence and was sent to Bronzefield Women's Prison. During her time behind bars, she turned to Christianity, seeking peace and understanding. Having already spent over a year in custody before sentencing, she was released in 2011. Since then, the sisters have vanished from public life. Their whereabouts are unknown, and we're just left with a story of shared madness, inexplicable violence, and the razor-thin line between delusion and reality. A highly disturbing case that does still continue to puzzle psychologists, law enforcement, and the public alike. So, what was going on in the minds of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson? Experts really struggled to put a label on it, but there are those 3 terms that keep coming up: First, induced delusional disorder, sometimes called a shared psychosis, which to me is just folie à deux, but either way, I'm not a professional, so I could be incorrect here. But induced delusional disorder is where one person develops a strong false belief and someone close to them, often a family member, starts believing it too. It's almost like paranoia spreading from one mind to another. In the case of the Eriksson twins, it's thought that Ursula was the first to spiral and Sabina became trapped in the same delusions. Then there's acute polymorphic psychotic disorder, and this is a sudden, intense break from reality. Thoughts, emotions, and perceptions shift really rapidly. One moment calm, the next paranoid, hallucinating, and hearing voices. And it often comes out of nowhere. And finally, there's folie à deux. Literally, madness of two. It's actually a really rare condition that's usually seen in extremely close pairs, twins, spouses, or family members. One person, the primary, starts experiencing delusions. The other, the secondary, absorbs the same false beliefs, almost like being pulled into the same hallucination. In short, the experts believe that Ursula's mind cracked first and Sabina's followed. Now, this isn't the only case in the world of true crime where people have been subjected to a shared madness. I think the term was first used to actually describe the Papan sisters in around 1933. These two sisters, Christine and Leah, were living maids for a family in France. And in February, I believe, 1933, they brutally murdered their employer's wife and daughter. And I mean, it was brutal. They mutilated them and they gouged their eyes out. It was crazy. The killings actually really shocked France because these sisters had never had any history of violence, ever. But the sisters lived in near total isolation and they really just relied on each other. Christine was the more dominant personality and she was also the older sister, and so it's believed that she may have been the one with mental illness. Leah, who was the younger sister, seemed a little bit more submissive and was quite dependent on Christine, so it was believed that she absorbed Christine's hostility and delusions. And psychiatrists argued at the time that Leah wouldn't have committed those murders had she not been with Christine. Other cases I can think off the top of my head that have been made mention of folie à deux would have been the Lonely Hearts Killers in the 1940s in America, Martha Black and Raymond Fernandez. Martha had got herself so entangled in Raymond's delusions that she fully participated in multiple murders of women that he seduced. And quite a few criminologists argue that this is a case of folie à deux, with Martha obviously being the submissive partner, while Fernandez was the delusional instigator. People have also actually speculated that the Bronte sisters had a folie à deux thing going on because of the shared delusional kind of worlds that they lived in. they had these intense fantasy worlds, both kind of shared those worlds together. And people do say that that is bordering on psychosis, a shared psychosis. Therefore, it would be a folie à deux. And I guess that's kind of interesting because that's where folie à deux potentially occurs without being criminal. It doesn't have to be criminal. It just has to be that shared delusion. So not a folie à deux as such, but a folie à famille would be the Trump family. And I'm sure some of you are aware of that story. Family members in Australia just literally abruptly down tools and fled their home. They left phones, they discarded phones along the route, the ones that had been taken with them. They left credit cards. They literally left every single thing behind at their home because they were convinced, absolutely convinced, as a family unit, that they were in severe danger. And then they drove across the country in this really bizarre road trip where they discarded possessions. And like I said, the mobile phones that had left the house were thrown out en route. The family split up at some points. One of the children left the trip early. Another child was found catatonic. And both the parents were discovered just wandering around in different towns. Really strange. They believed they were in this intense danger, but police found no evidence of that, and nobody had heard anything of the sort. There was no kind of threats that had ever been expressed to the family. But people believed that the parents were the ones who started with that delusion, and then the children absorbed it. And so we end up with a family of 5 in a folie à famille, madness shared by family. So the story of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson isn't the first time that there's been a shared madness. It's not anything new, it is just very rare. Now, this story about the Eriksson twins isn't a hugely popular one, but it is an important one because it's a frightening reminder of how fragile the human mind can be and how dangerous shared delusions can become. Two twin sisters, once really ordinary, swept up in a wave of madness so powerful that it spilled into the real world, leaving chaos, tragedy, and unanswered questions in its wake. So what do you think? What happened on that motorway? Could Sabina have acted differently if Ursula hadn't been there? Or was this descent into madness potentially inevitable? Could murder have been prevented if she'd been closely monitored after her breakdown on the motorway? And what really triggered the twins' spiral? Do we think it was genetics, their upbringing, or something far stranger we can't even understand? And finally, the notoriously not very good British justice system. Was it too lenient or fair, given the circumstances? I want to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments below. Every theory, every question, let's talk about it. What we do know for a fact is this. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in the shadows, but the ones living inside our own minds. And when two minds collide in madness, the consequences can be devastating.
I'm not a doctor. She has been knocked down.
Is she the one that speaks English or the other one?
She's the one on the...
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of the Thursday Brief, please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and hit the notification bell if you do want to keep up with what I am doing here. Please also share this video with anybody you know who is into true crime. It helps a little channel far more than you will ever realise. And remember, every Monday or so here, I post full-length deep dives where we go even further into cases like this, getting right into the nitty-gritties of the story. I'll see you all in the next one. And in the meantime, stay curious, stay kind, and take care of yourselves. I've been Fiona, and this has been Case Continued.